Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamerTech.com video, we're going to be doing a PlayStation 4 versus Xbox One hardware comparison. Now, before we jump completely into this, I probably in several months' time going to be a follow-up video, because there are still some specifications that are up in the air for both consoles, mostly concerning clock speeds, especially the CPU, but we can now have a reasonably good comparison between the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Now, for those of us who were actually watching the reveal, and I'm sure many of you did, it was around about an hour, as I'm sure you'll know. And I, along with many other people who are watching, and I count myself and friends, along with many viewers as well, because many people messaged me and was literally like, WTF was that? And I think the problem was a couple of things. They were not very clear with the actual hardware specifications, which is what we're going to be discussing in depth in this video, as well as the games. So the question is, how close were the leaked specifications that were going around for quite a while, where back when the machine was known as the Durango, of course, compared to the actual real specifications, and more to the point, how does it compare to the PlayStation 4? Well, when Microsoft were first telling us about the specifications on the actual conference itself, I don't know about you guys, but I was taking notes. I was actually trying to write down the notes, and the speaker himself was going through at a ridiculous pace, far too quickly, really. And I just got the feeling he was glossing over it, especially when he was talking about things in such broad strokes. He was literally using like a paint spray rather than a finite brush to paint in the details. And I'm not saying Sony had gone into finite detail with the PS4 reveal, but they had certainly gone into more detail than Xbox. But what he did, of course, mention was it was 8 gigabytes of RAM. He didn't mention the type. He mentioned that it was an X64-bit CPU, and he mentioned USB 3, a Blu-ray drive, and a few other bits and pieces, along with a 500 gigabyte hard drive. And finally, 5 billion transistors for the main processor. Well, 5 billion transistors, that's impressive and all, but what does it actually get us? Specifications such as the speed of the CPU, the type of the RAM, any buffers, the actual GPU clock speed, the amount of GCN cores, if it was using GCN cores, these were all largely ignored. So you could take this as one of two ways. The first, and I obviously wanted to give Microsoft the benefit of the doubt, was that the specifications were better or the same as what had been leaked, and they just didn't want to say anything right then because they weren't quite ready, and they wanted to hold out some stuff from Sony for, say, E3. The other option was that it was what had been leaked, or Microsoft weren't confident in the specifications, and they just wanted to kind of glaze over them a little bit. So this invariably came down to people just flat out asking, and eventually a panel was formed, and this panel did answer a series of questions. Microsoft's Larry Herb, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, that's H-Y-R-B, put together a series of answers on an architecture panel. And it's actually scary how close some of the leaked specifications were. Now, there were a couple that were slightly out, we'll go into those in a moment, but overall, the system is very accurate. Now, first thing I'm going to do is give you guys a broad overview. I'm also going to mention that probably tomorrow, I don't think I'll have time today, but most likely tomorrow I'm going to be doing an article. And in the article I'll be going into graphs, images of the consoles insides, because we do actually have those, by the way. I'm going to be doing a comparisons of all the various bits and pieces side by side, so you guys could check that out in a lot more detail. I say tomorrow, that would be the 24th of May 2013. I was about to say 14 there. So obviously if you're watching the video then you should be okay. And that will be a pretty cool article if I do say so myself. And also, I'll be doing over the next day or two the lighting for Killzone, as well as some other bits and pieces. Some pretty awesome stuff. Anyway, I'm going to give you guys a broad overview of what the Xbox One actually has inside of it, and then we'll compare that straight away to the PS4. So I'll give one specification of the PS4 and one of the Xbox One. So the CPU cores / threads are 8 and 8. So in other words, 8 CPU cores, and each can handle 1 thread apiece. That's exactly the same as the PS4, incidentally. As expected, we have not exact clarification at the moment of the CPU clock speed, although we'll go into that in a moment, and both are going to be using the AMD Jaguar CPUs. They both have the same level of cache, which would be 2 times 2 megabytes. We'll go into that more in a moment as well. We have, of course, them using exactly the same GPU, but we have 768 GPU cores for the Xbox One versus 1152 for the PS4. Peak shade out throughput, in other words, best world scenario, we'll go into that more as well, don't worry. That was 1.23 TFLOPS. I'll just say that again. That's 1.23 TFLOPS compared to 1.84 of the PS4. So obviously PS4 has more. We have 32 megabytes of ESRAM, which is embedded memory. We'll go into that a lot more as well, I promise. But that has a embedded memory bandwidth for about 102 gigabytes per second. Now, this is going to be very crucial for the system's operation. As for system memory, both are using 8 gigabytes. However, there's a distinct difference in the type of memory. The PS4 is going to be using GDDR5 RAM. Now, I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with that. It's using 5500 megahertz GDDR5 RAM, 256-bit bus memory bus, which gives you about 176 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. This is completely contrary to the Xbox One. The Xbox One is using 8 gigabytes once again, but it's using 2133 megahertz RAM compared to the 5500. I'll just say that again, that's 2133 megahertz, so that's a pretty high-end DDR3. That's 256-bit bus. However, because it's only using a DDR3, in other words, much less memory bandwidth, you're looking at 68.3 gigabytes per second. That's quite the discrepancy, so that's what I was saying, that the embedded memory will really come into play. We'll talk about that more in a moment though. So let's talk about the memory first, since it's probably the biggest gap, if you will, between the systems, and by which I mean it's definitely where the biggest discrepancy is. Now, we're actually starting now to get a lot of in-dice shots of both the memory, in terms of the physical memory, the buffer, and other bits and pieces as well. Now, I've already done an AMD Jaguar CPU video, but I'm going to be doing another one because now there has been a lot more confirmations on how everything works on the AMD Jaguar, whereas beforehand I was doing some educated guesswork, and yes, some of it was accurate, but some of it versus is well, 2 different things. But in terms of memory now, as I was saying, we have quite a lot of information. Now, I will include some of the CPU stuff on this one, but I will be most likely making another video because it's quite a in-depth topic. So, back to the memory. Now, when the PlayStation 4 was first announced, or not even announced, should I say, rumoured, the specifications of it in terms of the amount of memory were actually a lot lower. Indeed, because GDDR5 memory was, well, quite difficult to get hold of, especially when the PS4 was early in development, Sony bet the farm in many ways on the fact that they could actually get a viable amount of memory. And many people have said 2 gigabytes, maybe 4 if you're lucky. And of course, as high density modules became more available and easier to manufacture, Sony said 4. However, there were rumours from within the company and murmuring that they didn't actually want to settle on 4. They wanted to go with 8, and there's a distinct reason for this. I'm sure you guys have probably figured this out, but basically games are becoming bigger now. You can check out my Killzone video, and you can really see just how memory intensive some applications was. Or you can check out the article as well. That's on a Red Gaming Tech. Or you can check out the video and the article because they both talk about slightly different things. But the memory breakdown of Killzone is pretty insane. You're looking at a ridiculous amount of textures, memory, if only for the textures alone. And honestly speaking, if they'd have stuck with 2 or 4 gigs of RAM, it really wouldn't have been possible to get that level of fidelity onto that amount of memory. Microsoft, of course, knew that this wasn't the case. Microsoft designed the console to begin with that they wanted 8 gigabytes of memory because they wanted it to be so multimedia focused. I'm not going to go into whether they're right or wrong on that decision in terms of whether I like the multimedia-ness of the system. I'll go into that in a different video. But because of this, because of the bloat, I don't like to use bloat, but because of the bloated requirements of needing multimedia, because of the larger requirements of the UI, the operating system, the fact that it needs to switch between applications and all of this, they knew 8 gigabytes was basically the figure that they needed to go for. There was no real other way to go ahead. So, are there any benefits of the DDR3 route? Well, there are a couple. The first is cost. Quite simply put, despite the fact that the 2133 MHz DDR3 memory isn't as cheap as some memory types that you can get, it's certainly cheaper than GDDR5. There's another benefit to that as well, higher yields. In other words, it's a lot easier to get hold of that memory. There is another benefit as well, power requirements. Quite simply put, the power requirements of the Xbox, in terms of memory at least, will be lower simply because GDDR5 memory is quite power hungry. The PlayStation 4's memory is pretty easy to understand. It's a simple, unified approach. I don't really think it takes me much to explain this, but I'll go through it anyway. The SoC, or system on a chip, that would be the GPU, the CPU, and some of the other key components that make the, well, system work, basically, are connected to a high-speed bus, and that's 256-bit, just to illustrate, and that in turn is connected to the memory. And there are a few other jiggery pokeries going around, but I'm not going to bother to go into those because they're not that important for the understanding of this. And that's pretty much all she wrote. Now, in actuality, as I mentioned before, the memory itself is pretty easy to understand, and it's very similar to a graphics card that you can buy, either AMD or NVIDIA, as it turns out. And it's not that complicated. I know that's not exactly a major analysis, but it's fairly simple to understand it, and it has many benefits. I have heard some rumours, by the way, although they've been fairly unconfirmed, that I really want to hear more, that the CPU itself actually has a bandwidth limitation upon it. I've heard figures from between 20 and 30 gigabytes, and the rest, or the large majority of the bandwidth goes towards the GPU, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, the benefit from the perspective of programmers and developers is simple. They can utilize the bandwidth very simply. They don't really need to concern themselves with juggling resources. It's just there. Now, as I was talking about in the Killzone analysis video, that isn't to say that you can waste things. I don't care how powerful the GPU or the CPU or how much memory you've got or the type of memory you've got. There are finite resources. It's like if you have a box, for example. It doesn't matter how big that box is. If you keep filling it with I don't know, junk or whatever you're filling it with, eventually that box, container, whatever, will get filled. It's the same as a football stadium. If you get a massive ass football stadium and you start filling the whole thing with people, you know, even if you increase the capacity from like 2,000 people to like 10,000 people, it will still get filled, and you get the idea. So you still have to be smart, basically, with the resources, but the resources there are easier to utilize. This is a bit contrary to the Xbox philosophy. Now, DDR3 memory is not bad, and most Windows-based PCs are still, well, most PCs generally, even Apple ones are going to be using DDR3 of some derivative. Now, there are different types of DDR3, and Microsoft have definitely got one of the faster brands. There's a problem with DDR3, however. It doesn't give enough bandwidth for graphics. Now, we'll go into that in just a second. So what Microsoft have done is they've basically added another set of memory, in this case, a buffer, if you will. This is an SRAM. The idea here is that it's lower latency. Now, the ESRAM itself, this is the important and crucial part. The ESRAM itself is actually embedded onto the SoC. In other words, the system on chip, the Jaguar, and the actual GCN cores. So we'll go into this in a moment because this is a very crucial matter. So the ESRAM is basically built right on there, and that helps to make up for the memory bandwidth of the DDR3, because as I said, the DDR3 memory is just not enough to give you the bandwidth that, well, high-end graphics now are starting to require, especially for consoles. Now, it also uses what are known as data move engines. Now, data move engines, this is going to get a bit interesting to explain all this, but data move engines I've done a video on this, so I'd recommend you check it out, and there's not really that much changed on them, but I'll give you a quick brief overview. Data move engines are there to shuffle data around for basically free. The PlayStation 3 actually did similar, or could be done similar, with the SPUs, which were part of the Power PC architecture of the cell processor. The purpose here is to basically throw around information while not taxing the rest of the system. This is also, by the way, built on to the same SoC. So all of this is part of the same processor die. So in other words, it can encode, decode, and do whatever it needs to do. And the CPU doesn't have to do anything. The GPU doesn't have to do anything with any compute calculations and so on. In other words, it can just sit there relaxing. And this definitely has some benefits, especially, for example, if the GPU and CPU are being taxed heavily. Let's say they're at 99 or 100% load. Let's just go with theoreticals here, it's easier. And let's just say that theoretically both are completely taxed to buggery. They cannot do anything else. They are 100% on load. That means the move engines really come into play, because as it turns out, the move engines in a theoretical world can actually move around slightly less data than what the GPU could if it was being involved in the calculations. However, as is normally the case, is a reason that people do things, and in this case the move engines are evolved so that the GPU can do other things other than shuffling data around, because obviously that's not exactly the best use of its time when you prefer it to draw pretty trees or something similar in the next crisis. So Sony themselves bet the farm, if you will, on GDDR5 memory, because they basically really knew that 4 gigs was the minimum they could get away with. 4 gigs was, well, 4 gigs would be the minimum. Let's just go with that. Because by the time you've started to account for operating system overheads, by the time you start to talk about data, images. I mean, just to give you guys a quick example, and once again, you can check more of this out on redgamingtech.com. The actual images, this is on the demo, the Killzone Shadowfall demo. You have 1.3 gigs, I'm just rounding these figures up, 1.3 gigabytes of non-streaming textures. And the streaming pool itself is 572 megabytes, render targets 800 megabytes. If you basically add all of this up, I missed a few as well, you get basically 3 gigs of memory just on the graphics. And if you talk about system stuff, which includes the Havoc Scratch, which I believe is for physics, Havoc is a physics engine. If you talk about sound, which is 553, the Havoc Scratch 350, the Game Heap 318, various assets, entities, blah blah blah, 143, animation is 75. 1.5. Now, all of this comes to 1.5 gigs. So right there, I'm not going to do any particularly complicated math, but it's just over 4.6 gigs in total. And that's basically them not really trying. And you've got to also take into account with all of this that this is not including the operating system. Now, operating system resources, as far as we understand it with Sony, they're still getting these down. So in other words, apparently right now the CPUs themselves are actually using 6 rather than 8 because they're not really sure just what the CPU resources are and so on. So yeah, that's absolutely insane, as I'm sure you'll agree. So Sony really did bet the farm on the memory. So because of this, they decided to go with the DDR5 route, and as it turns out, it made life a lot easier for developers. So the 32 megabytes of ESRAM, as I've said, has about 102 gigabytes per second bandwidth. The purpose of this is most likely going to be for developers to basically offloading certain requests or storage and that type of thing. This isn't anything particularly new. The GameCube did this, the Xbox 360 had this, and so on. And the purpose is to basically get around limitations. Now, 32 megabytes sounds paltry. If we're talking 8 gigs for 32 megs, what the hell, you know? It's not even, 10%. It's a ridiculous percentage. So, what gives? I mean, 10 times that, and it's only 320 megabytes, and that's nowhere near 8 gigs. So what the hell's 32 megabytes going to do? That's what a lot of people are saying. As it turns out, it's actually pretty reasonable. It's a decent amount of cache, assuming it's going to be mostly used for frame buffers, to actually have a decent hit rate in terms of workloads. Now, what a hit rate is in this case, I'm going to vastly simplify this, but hit rate is basically, do you have it? In other words, let's say that, I don't know, there's 2 people in a room, and let's say let's say there's 3 people in a room, and let's say that I hand out a pen and I'm, can't see who I've given it to. Let's say you've blindfolded me and I hand you a pen and someone takes it, so it's either Bill or Tom. Now, if I request Tom, do you have this pen? He will say, yes, I have this pen. In other words, it's whether that data is present on that memory, whether it's actually necessary. If not, then the CPU will have to start looking for it in a different place. Now, that's a pretty bad explanation, I know, but I just wanted to put it in there because I don't want to explain too much about that. You can always Google that as well yourself, which would probably clear it up if you're not 100% sure, but I think that does for a basic explanation. Now, according to leaks, it appears that the 50 gigabytes per second of bandwidth in each direction with this SRAM, that gives you about 102 total. Now, the important thing to remember here is that if it's used correctly, the embedded SRAM should significantly cut down on GPU memory bandwidth requests. So in other words, it will basically give the GPU much more bandwidth than the DDR3 2133 megahertz of memory would otherwise let you believe. But that is assuming it is managed efficiently. If it is managed efficiently, and developers get a handle on it, and that's the important thing, it could well be that in reality, there's not a huge discrepancy between the two. The problem here is how it's going to develop as games become more complicated. In other words, will we get to a point where, quite simply put, it may not grow well? In other words, it may not expand well over time. So it's very difficult to know, but theoretically it should handle it okay. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about very heavily is the GPU. Now, the GPU has also been subject to much debate. There's one thing we should clear up, and that is we do not know how fast the clock speed is for the Xbox. However, from what we understand, it is 800 megahertz. Now, I have no doubt that if Microsoft could it would get that up a little bit higher, maybe 850, maybe 900. However, there is a massive disparity, and even if they were to crank it up to the 1 gigahertz, which is supposedly the max that it can go up to, then it still wouldn't be as fast as the PS4s. Now, there's a simple reason behind this. The PS4 has, well, 18. The Xbox 720, the Xbox One has only 12. So, the first question many are going to scream is, couldn't Microsoft just increase the number? I mean, it's not released yet, right? Well, why didn't they increase the number? These have all been things that people have been asking me, and, why did they come up with this? Why wasn't it 14? Why was it 12? Why, if it's costing the same? Well, it's all kind of a bit of an oddity. As I said, remember how earlier on, about 10 minutes ago, I said that Sony bet the farm on the memory? It just happens that they were right with their gamble. When they did this, they vastly simplified the SoC. When they did this, they basically said, okay, we are confident, we believe, it's almost like you put money into the stock market, right? You say to yourself, I'm confident based upon the performance of this company, or based upon looking at the history of what's going on, that I'm going to be right and I'm going to put my money in X. And that's it. So Sony decided, okay, we're looking at the speed of the progress of the rate that GDDR5 memory is improving. We are confident it will give us the size of memory modules we need at the amount we need. We're going to go with this route. Microsoft didn't. They could not afford, because of their vision, to go this route. They needed to go for the 8 gigs of RAM. I've already explained all that, so how does this tie in? Well, as it turns out, from what I'm understanding, reading several websites and leaks and stuff like that, because the die, remember how I said that the ESRAM and the move engines are on the same die? You've only got a certain amount of space to work with on that die, right? That die cannot just keep expanding because of heat reasons, of power reasons, and various other bits and pieces. So, yeah, something has to give. And in this case, it was the GCN cores, and it's also the ROPS as well. So you've got these additional compute units, these 18 versus 12, but you've also got 32 ROPS versus 16. Now, ROPS are also known as, what are they known as? Render output units, if I remember correctly. And sometimes they can also be known as raster operation pipeline, I think. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, but they're basically used as the final step in the rendering process. Now, in theory, 16 should be enough. Indeed, 32 is a bit of an odd number for the PS4. Apparently, it's too much, but we don't really know what they're planning to do. Maybe Sony just wants to go, overboard, whatever. But yeah, that's basically why the Xbox has the 12. So, in terms of peak shader power, and that's the important word, you're looking at still about 5 times more performance, although Microsoft themselves can say up to 8 times better GPU performance. So, is there anything particularly exciting? Is there anything particularly helpful that Microsoft could do? No. Now, that's a bit of a blunt question and a bit of a blunt statement, but it's that simple, actually. They can't really do much. The best option they can do is to increase the clock speed. Now, there's a good reason they can't just ramp it up to 1 gigahertz, which is supposedly the max that they can actually do. But the reason they can't is simple. Heat and power. Now, that's not to say they could go to 850. That's not to say they could go to 900, for example. I'm just saying. But they still need to worry about this heat. They still need to worry about these power requirements. So all of this basically means that GPU and CPU, well, CPU-wise, they're roughly the same. There isn't that much difference between the two systems, if I'm completely honest. Clock speeds are still being nailed down, so it could be from 1.6, it could go to 1.7, just for example. But it's still really up in the air. Now, I'm going to make another video specifically going into the CPU because that's quite a big topic itself. And I want to really go ahead and dive into it headlong. I'll probably do another article as well on that. What else was it I wanted to discuss? Because there was something else. I know. Ah, yes. So, what does that mean for us as PC gamers? Or let's say you're not a PC gamer. Let's say you want to play PC games on your Xbox. The bottom line is, it's still behind the PS4 in terms of raw hardware performance, as far as we understand it. And it seems that Microsoft are going the other route. They want to do so much other stuff. They want to really focus on this whole, well, everything. They want to focus on this whole one entertainment system philosophy. Whether that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing for them is unknown. However, there's no denying that Sony have certainly won in two ways. They have more GPU power, and they have more memory that's readily available in terms of bandwidth. There is going to be a couple of things that's still undecided. First is how big the OSs are. As far as we understand it, the Xbox OSs are going to be larger. There's 3 of them after all. However, 3 doesn't necessarily mean that it's big. For example, if I was to say to you, I'm going to hand you, 3 thimbles compared to 3 cups, it's obvious to figure compared to 1 cup, you see what I'm saying? So we'll have to just see what's bigger in terms of taking up memory on the actual, whether all of them load up into resident memory, even if they do, how big their memory footprints are, and dozens of other questions, which I'm sure will be answered. As I've said, Sony are still trying to narrow down how much CPU usage certain things use. And we just don't know yet. So I have a feeling over the next, let's say, 6 months, a lot of this stuff will come out. And I think another 12 months after that, we'll start to really see the differences. So anyway, I think that just about does it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it somewhat. Coming up for me in the next couple of days, I will be doing the AMD Jaguar, the actual follow-up video, which will actually have a lot more stuff in the die and in die shots as well. I'll have the article from this as well, which is going to have a lot more of it, the actual images and comparisons and stuff to make it easier for you guys. So definitely head out to Red Gaming Tech. I will also be doing the Killzone graphic stuff. I know I did some of it, but I also know I promised to do the lighting and so forth, and I haven't forgotten about that, so I will be doing that as well. And there are some other bits and bobs as well that we will be following. Hopefully after that, things will settle down for a couple of days, and I can finish up the move to the website. Move to a different website. Oh, sorry, move the server to a different website. I got there in the end, didn't I? It only took me 2 or 3 attempts. And, English is my mother tongue. You just wouldn't believe it sometimes. But, what else is there? Yes, and we're also going to be looking, of course, at more reviews and so on. There are a couple of new games coming out. And we're also going to be covering some other bits and bobs that will be secret, which we will cover them anyway. Amata is going to be buggering off, and she's going to be leaving me forever alone. However, there will be a couple of other people helping me out behind the scenes. And she's going to be going to the MCM Expo, which is in the Excel Centre in London. She will be there for 2 or 3 days, getting some footage and so on, which will be pretty cool. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you around soon. Take care, and bye for now.